Well, good morning, Shabbat Shalom. So glad you're with me. This is Rabbi Shalom Torah Study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and I'm really glad you're here. This morning, my colleagues, Rabbi Hirsch and Rabbi Gelman, have the morning off to enjoy a little bit of time with their families. And this morning, we're going to be devoting our Torah study to something very special. This last week, we commemorated the yahrzeit of my teacher, Rabbi Harold Schulweis. Rabbi Schulweis was Valley Beth Shalom's rabbi from 1970 till his passing in 2014, and was my teacher since I was a teenager. Left a beautiful legacy of Jewish teaching, of deep and powerful interpretive Torah. And it is our privilege each year around this time, around his yahrzeit, to remember him and to gather in our memories, our tributes to his wonderful Torah. I'd like to begin today with a sermon that he delivered at Valley Beth Shalom in 1979, in which he asked a question which is so, in some places, so rare among rabbis. He asked, what for? What is all this Jewish stuff for? What is the deepest meaning and purpose, the teleology? It's a fancy word meaning the purpose, the end, the reason why we do all the Jewish things that we do. We were lucky because that sermon was published in Moment magazine in 1980, and we can look at it even today and enjoy it. It was called An Eye for an Eye. There's the sermon there. And he asks this question with great frankness and I think deep searching. He says, look, a lot of people will tell us that the purpose, the central goal of Jewish life is the acquisition of wisdom, the acquisition of knowledge. After all, we're the most educated people anyplace. And what Jewish child isn't pushed by his parents to do as well as he can in school? Learning is such a core part of Judaism. But then he points out that learning and study, as important as it is in Jewish life, is never an end in itself. It is always seen by the tradition as instrumental, as leading to something other, namely leading to the acquisition of a certain kind of character. And in fact, the tradition was very worried about learning and wisdom and intellectuality without a deeper moral purpose. So he says, okay, maybe we can look someplace else then. Maybe the purpose is spirituality, prayer and ritual. And here too, he says, yes, spirituality is very important. And God forbid a rabbi would ever, decry or condemn or degrade or denigrate the practice of religious ritual. That's not going to happen, of course. But religious ritual in Jewish life, just like learning, has always been instrumental to something higher. And the higher goal of all of this is the acquisition of a certain kind of character. Here's his words, which I think are so lovely. So what is the end? What is the what for? The answer is the cultivation of Yiddish neshama, a soul and a character of Rahmanis, of Rahmanut, of Ehrlichkeit, and of Edelkeit. Now, first of all, I think it's so interesting. I think it's so wonderful that what he does is he's presenting to us a thesis which is completely unexpected. I mean, we expect a rabbi to tell us we're supposed to come to shul, we should be coming to shul more often, we should be keeping more ritual, we should be keeping kosher, we should be making Shabbos, we should be celebrating holidays. We expect a rabbi to be telling us we ought to be learning more Torah. And he's going to tell us that, of course. But he's telling us that all of that isn't for its own sake. All of that, and certainly isn't to fulfill some kind of guilty obligation that we carry around to our ancestors, making our mothers and fathers feel better. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it, he says, is the cultivation of a certain kind of character, a certain kind of personality, a way of walking the world. And I think that what's wonderful is that the use of the Yiddish phrases, Ehrlichkeit and Edelkeit and Rahmanis, Menschlichkeit, he's using those words because he knows that he's offering us a thesis which is very countercultural. You're all expecting the rabbi to tell you to keep kosher. And when the rabbi comes and says, no, I want something bigger than that, because keeping kosher has a purpose, because learning Torah has a purpose, because coming to shul has a purpose. And its purpose is something rather universal, not simply particular. It's universal in the sense that it's about the kind of human being you are. But it's a human being that is interpreted and filtered and shaped by Jewish culture. And it's shaped into a character, a certain kind of character type that we call a mensch, a tzaddik, a chassid, something of deep kindness and gentleness and goodness. This is something that Schulweis maintained for his entire life. Jewish life has a teleology. It has a purpose. And all of the elements of Jewish life, the ritual, the synagogue, the institutions, the symbols, the learning, the language, all of the things we do as Jews are not simply done to follow the dictums of an ancient text or a God who commands. All of the things we do are about creating a certain kind of human being and of finding deepest happiness and satisfaction in the cultivation of that personality. Well, before we jump into the elements of that, let's step back for a minute and notice what he did there, because there's a very subtle but very powerful philosophical statement being made. How do you measure the truth of a religion? When religion tells us something, how do we measure its truth? Well, there are many ways of establishing the truth of a religion. You could establish the truth of its stories. You could look at the effectiveness of its institutions, for example. You could see how many people adhere to that religion and say it's majority rule. But for Schulweis, the only answer to that question is, what kind of person does it make me? The truth of a religion is, what kind of human being does it create? The truth of a religion is, how does it shape human life? How does it shape the life of all of us on this planet? And what's interesting is that he maintained that from the very beginning. He graduated college in 1945, one of 64 men who graduated Yeshiva College, Yeshiva University's college. And 24 of them were asked to write an essay for a short essay for the college yearbook. This is Harold Schulweis's very first published piece of work. He's published hundreds and hundreds of articles, and sermons, and addresses, and speeches, and books during the course of his lifetime. But the very first one was a piece that he wrote for his college yearbook, Hamasmid, in 1945. And the ostensible question of that essay, I'll show it to you. Here's the essay. The ostensible question of the essay, called Freedom and the Religion of the State. In 1945, America had just won the Second World War in May of 1945, April. The question was, the American occupying army in Japan was encountering Japanese religion. And so much of Japanese religion was focused on the emperor. The emperor was deified, but the emperor was the one that sent Japan to war. And while American democracy demands tolerance of religion, and it demands that the state not interfere in religious life, does that apply here in a religion which sent a country to war and ended up killing so many, many, many thousands of people? And he's going to discuss this question at some length. But at the very end of the essay, he makes a very powerful statement. If we believe religion to be all-embracing, we cannot adopt the philosophy of rendering unto Caesar the thing which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's. The false cleavage has separated the soul from the body, leaving the body unclean, uninspired, doomed to eternal evil and hopelessness. This religious schism from politics, that's the separation of religion from politics, makes of religion a dormant, static metaphysics, a theory motionless in the world. Religion redefined religion redefined acts as a check on the state politics, affirming that which is harmful to the general good is impious, that's unreligious, and must be altered immediately. You can't take religion out of the world. Religion has to be all embracing. It has to speak to everything. And we can't separate religion from politics, because politics is the domain of the general good. And religion has to have something to say about that. Let me show you the very end of the essay. He says, fundamentally, then, sincere religion cries out for the welfare of man, for us all, not just men. It strives to make him a better man. It asserts his God-given rights to economic, political, and social justice, and reaffirms man's dignity and innate goodness. And he ends with this amazing observation. Religion can be tested on ethical grounds. The sincerity of religious theory is to be manifest in human behavior, in the relationship between man and his neighbor. I ask you to excuse the sexist language, but the amazing thing is that in 1945, at the age of 20, Harold Schulweis already articulated this sort of approach to religious life. The question isn't, the question is, what's the truth of religion? And the answer is, the truth of religion is to be found in the kind of human being that it cultivates. Does it cultivate a person who is gentle, who is giving, who is kind, who is compassionate? Or does it cultivate a human being who is other, who is cruel, who is brutal? Now, this is a remarkable question, because you will hear that answer given in very different ways. You will hear in the community, in the Jewish community and in the general community, a voice that says that somehow religion and ethics must be separated, and that religion demands a kind of obedience that denies the ethical sensibility. The locus classicus, the place where we can see this best, are two stories in the book of Genesis, stories we've talked about very frequently. In the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis, we have a story of Abraham being told that God is about to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham detects an injustice in this, and he speaks up. Abraham, Vayigash Avraham, says the Torah, he steps forward and he says to God, if there's 50 good people in the city, will you not spare the 50? Far be it from you, far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the innocent and the guilty together. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? But what's going on in that story? What's going on is, first of all, Abraham has an ethical sensibility which is separate from his religious sensibility. That is, he has a sense of right and wrong, which is not given him by God. Because God has told him what God's going to do. And Abraham says, no, but you can't. It's unethical. That is, Abraham's ethical sensibility derives from someplace else. And number two, that ethic governs God as well. That's what the question is. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Aren't you God? Aren't you also governed by right and wrong, justice and injustice? Is this the world you would want to create? A world where religion trumps justice, religion overcomes justice, where obedience to religion is more powerful than ethics? Now, the second story, which is in the same Torah portion, just 4 chapters later in Genesis, is where the story, where that conflict really comes to rest. And that's the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham is told, take your son, your only one, Isaac, to the mountain and offer him there as an offering. And he goes, and he goes. He goes to do it. And the question there is, how is it that God commands a man to overcome his fatherly love for his son, to overcome his respect for his wife, who after all gave birth to this kid at the age of 90, to overcome his inner love and reverence for life, his sensibility, and to offer up a child because God said so? Now, It's a dividing line in our religion. It's a dividing line in all religion. Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher, called it the teleological suspension of the ethical. He said sometimes religion demands that we do that which is unethical. And there are many thinkers and scholars and religious personalities through the generations who have seen Abraham as a hero because he was willing to sacrifice not just his son, but to sacrifice his sense of right and wrong, to give up his sense of right and wrong in obedience to God. That's so loyal, so loving, so close was he to God's will that even his own conscience had to be defeated in order to obey God's commandment. That's one way to read religion. Schulweis disagreed rather radically. For Schulweis, nothing overcomes religion. Nothing overcomes ethics. Religion cannot overcome ethics. And so for Schulweis, when the angel calls from heaven and says, don't touch the boy, that's the voice of Abraham's conscience. That's the voice of Abraham's conscience reasserting itself in opposition to anything else that would get in the way. And for Schulweis, the ultimate purpose of religion is the cultivation of conscience. Now, conscience is a very interesting thing, don't you think? I mean, conscience is of us, but it's not of us. I mean, it's certainly in me because it's part of me. I feel its drive, its impulse, but it tortures me, it pushes me, it makes me feel terrible when I do the wrong thing. Freud thought it was the internalized voice of the parent, the super ego. Schulweis demands something different. Schulweis thinks that it's the internalized voice of the divine. In fact, he looked for a word. The Hebrew word for conscience is matzpun, which is a modern Hebrew word. The root of the word tzadik pei nun, safon, means north, and a matzpun is a compass. Conscience is our moral compass because it points to the north. It points us in the right direction. It's also from the word being hidden because it's something that's hidden, the power of the magnet, the power of the compass. And in some ways, the power of conscience is hidden within us. Conscience. He looked for a Hebrew word for conscience in the Bible, and there really isn't a word, but he proposed a very interesting idea. There is a phrase in the Bible which occurs again and again, and it's the phrase Yirat Elohim. Yirah means fear. Yirat Elohim is a phrase that occurs, interestingly, when Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, meet non-Jews in the Bible. So, for example, there's a story in the book of Genesis when Abraham is taking residence with King Abimelech. He tells Abimelech that Sarah, his wife, is not his wife, but his sister. And Abimelech comes to her. And Abimelech is about to have relations with Sarah. And suddenly he's struck down with a plague. And he comes to Abraham and says, what'd you do this for? She's your wife. And Abraham says, I didn't know if there's any yirah in this place. I didn't know if there's any fear of God in this place. I didn't know if this was a place of common morality. Yirah means common decency, common morality. It's a morality that's not derived from God because these are not Jews. These are not Israelites. These are people that worship other gods. But there's a yirah. There is a common sense of human decency that grips all human beings. When Joseph's brothers confront Joseph, they don't know that he's Joseph. They think he's the prime minister of Egypt. The question of whether there's yirah there, whether there is anyone, whether there is any common decency. And in the book of Leviticus, there are certain commandments that you're told out of yirah because they come out of common decency. Yirah means conscience. It means decency. It's an inborn sense of right and wrong, but it's cultivated by a tradition. It's cultivated by culture. And conversely, it can be deadened by a culture. And this is one of the things that scared Rabbi Schulweis in his study of the Holocaust. He was so taken by the phenomenon of Christians who stood up to rescue Jews from the Nazis at the risk of terrible consequences to themselves. But he was also really interested in why it was that so many ordinary Germans went along, and so many ordinary Poles and Ukrainians and Romanians went along. It was not just out of vicious anti-Semitism, that's certainly true, but there was something else at work. There was a deadening of conscience, that comes out of a cultural milieu. We all know the famous Milgram experiments, the experiments by the psychologists who taught those young undergraduates in school to torture the person who was answering the questions wrong. And the question was, under what circumstances is conscience deadened? And under what circumstances is conscience enlivened? And if religion has a real purpose, says Schulweis, its purpose is to enliven, to cultivate, to sharpen, to clarify, and to inspire conscience, that aspect of us which pushes us forward. That, for Rabbi Schulweis, is really revelation. That is, one of the great questions of contemporary religion is, how do we read the Bible when the Bible says God speaks to us? The phrase that is repeated most often in the Hebrew Bible, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, God said to Moses what he said. How do we understand that phrase? How do we understand God, who is infinite and beyond all understanding, speaking to a human being? And in what language does God speak? And for Schulweis, well, the answer is God speaks in the language of conscience. God speaks in the language of a sense of right and wrong. Here are his statements. Let's look together. This comes from his book, For Those Who Can't Believe. Conscience is the inner witness to the covenant that carries the divine and human signatures. The status and role of conscience in religion casts a different complexion on revelation. Revelation is God speaking to us. Revelation is not a one-way directive from above. It's not God in heaven shouting down, like Feinstein, no more lobster, right? Or a human projection from below. That is something we just made up. Revelation is a dialogue. Revelation is a dialogue. Torah is a record of the dialogue between Israel, between the people Israel, and God, who speaks to us through the voice of conscience. Revelation is a dialogue of reciprocal covenant, an ongoing process of listening and interpreting, of receiving and giving. Awareness of having entered the covenant makes it impossible to separate the divine and human element in the encounter of revelation. Conscience is the hyphen of the human divine covenant that runs both ways. Conscience and commandment are not rivals, but co-respondents of a moral covenant. So what is he saying? He's saying that God speaks to us through the voice of conscience, but it's a process of conversation, because we have to live it. We have to apply this. We have to find a way to understand it and find a way to apply it into our own lives. That's what conscience is. That's what revelation really is. A little bit later, in his last book, the book called Conscience, which is his last book, this is what he writes. He says, "The sickness of our age is a failure of conscience. Too many listen to the voices of others who would make slavish followers of us. Jews should never contemplate the suspension of the ethical. If the commandment is not ethical, then it cannot come from God." So from the early part of his career, he was willing to talk about some kind of dialogue. By the end of Rabbi Schulweis's career, he became much more sort of absolute about this. And I think personally, this is a response to 9/11. Remember, 9/11 comes. 19 men hijack airplanes and fly them into the World Trade Center, killing thousands and thousands of people. And they did it in the name of their God. They did it in the name of religion. And for Schulweis, this was a disturbing, I think, for every religious person, For every religious person, this had to have been a very disturbing and difficult moment. And so he says, the ethical is the ultimate test of anything religious. If it's not ethical, it's not from God, right? It cannot be halakha. It cannot be a command from on high if it's not ethical. That's the first question. Is it right? Is it the right thing to do? If it's not ethical, we must have heard wrong. And we must test our hearing. If the commandment is not ethical, then the source is not the commander we are to follow. It is no act of piety to raise our children to be followers without question. To do so would be to bind our own children on the altar, to kill their critical minds. Civilization cannot, this is the last word in the book, by the way. This is the epilogue of the book. Civilization cannot endure without conscience. With the death of conscience, civilization is imperiled. Conscience has many foes and many obstacles, but as the prophets of all ages testify, conscience is irrepressible. That blessed obduracy, that stubbornness, is the hope of our moral sanity and survival. It has been told to you, O man, what is good and what God requires of you, to do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with God, then your name will achieve wisdom. To put conscience into the heart of religion is to say that conscience has a chance, that it's not inevitable, that interests, appetites, desires, prejudices, hates, small thinking, narrow thinking is always going to defeat it. To put conscience at the heart of faith is to say that the purpose of believing and the purpose of all that we do as religious people, the purpose of ritual, the purpose of study, the purpose of affiliation, the purpose of prayer, is to cultivate a very deep sense of our commitment to good, to the right. And that this is what Judaism is really about. To cultivate Tselem Elokim, an image of God that lives inside of us, but an image of God that demands that just like God, we take responsibility for all that is around us. Now, one last interesting fact about this. In 1993, the Rabbinical Assembly, my union of rabbis, comes to Los Angeles for a conference. And Rabbi Schulweis was asked to be the keynote speaker the first night of the conference. I was there, I remember this. He had just gotten out of the hospital. He'd been very, very sick with a heart attack. He gotten out of the hospital and he came to address the convention. And this was when there was a very active conversation going on about whether gays and lesbians ought to be accepted into our community. In 1992, Rabbi Schulweis gave this clarion sermon. He was the first conservative rabbi to come out loud and in public and said, it's time to put away all of the prejudice and all of the hatred and all of the fear of gay and lesbian Jews and welcome them to our community. He gave this as a sermon in 1992 and received the only standing ovation he'd ever gotten for a sermon at Valley Shalom. And that year we started an organization called Response, which was for the parents and families of gay and lesbians. And we welcomed many, many same-sex couples and many, many gay and lesbian Jews, self-identified gay and lesbian Jews, to our synagogue. There were families that found this deeply objectionable. And he gave many sessions following up where he said, you can't exclude morality from our faith. And while there is an explicit commandment written in the Torah that says a man who lies with a man, that's an abomination, and a page later it says that person shall be put to death, we can't read it that way. We can't read it as a condemnation of homosexual love. Everyone has a need to love, a right to love. And if it's an ethical relationship, a responsible relationship, then it is holy. It is to be sanctified. It is to be accepted. It is to be welcomed. And these are Jews to be welcomed. Not just Jews, they're our children. They're our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, our uncles, our aunts, our neighbors, our friends. They're part of us. This was the sermon he gave in 1992. In 1993, he comes to the Rabbinical Assembly and he gives a version of that same sermon, but he gave it on a theoretical basis. He said, the reason we have to do this is because morality has to be moved to the center of Jewish law. You can't cultivate a love for Jewish law without cultivating a love for the ethics that it teaches. And that ethics has to be the ultimate measure and medium of Jewish legal thinking. Well, the next morning, he gave I think it was a Thursday night. He gives this the next morning. The chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Chancellor Ismar Shorsh, a great historian of Judaism and a wonderful teacher of Judaism, but a man who comes from a very different religious sensibility, gave a response. And the response wasn't nice. He was very angry, Ismar Shorsh was. And he basically said, morality has no place. Morality has no place in the decisions we make about Jewish law and the cultivation of Jewish tradition. We follow legal precedents, and legal precedents have their own logic and can't be determined by what we believe is right at the moment, because morality changes. It has its fads and its fashions, and it gets blown by the wind. Well, there was an argument. I mean, for the rest of the conference, the conference sort of split in half, this rabbinical conference, between those who followed Schulweis and those who followed Shorsh. The followers of Schulweis argued that morality must always be at the core of our religion. Otherwise, what are we doing here? And the others said that morality changes and we must hold adherence, strict adherence to what's written in the text, what's written in the Bible, what's written in the Talmud, the law that has been traditionally held. And it was such an interesting conversation. A month later, Rabbi Schulweis reflected on that conversation, and he realized that Rabbi Shorsh was afraid. He was afraid that conscience is too weak a basis on which to found a religion. Because conscience, our moral vision does change from generation to generation. We do expand, and sometimes we contract our moral vision. We change our minds about what's right and what's wrong. Think about the ways we think now about gays and lesbians, our friends and family. Think about the way that women are treated in the community. Think about the way that racial tensions are resolved in our culture and our community. We do change our moral vision, but Schulweis still maintained that to abandon morality is to abandon the very heart of religious life. And Rabbi Shorsh, Professor Shorsh, was so afraid of this. And it's that fear of holding on and not letting go, Schulweis maintained, that's really the enemy of the development and the progress that we would make in religious life. He was asked in an interview just a few months before he died what he thought his greatest accomplishment was in the rabbinate. It's an amazing question to ask someone who'd been a rabbi for so many years, Rabbi Schulweis. And his answer was that he was proud of so many of the things that he created, but the thing that he most cherished was the creation of his organization, the Jewish World Watch. Jewish World Watch was created really in the last years of his rabbinate as a way of responding to genocide, first in Darfur and then the Congo and then all over the world. It's an organization that still exists and thrives and does wonderful, wonderful work in the community. And the reason why is because it was the culmination of all of the strands of his religious life. That to maintain a sense of religiosity, a sense of God's presence in your heart, to pray, to perform mitzvot, to read the Torah, to be close to a religious life without touching the world is an anathema to him. From the very beginning, when he was 20 years old, he made that statement. The empirical test of a religion is the behavior of the people who are its adherents, the character of those people, the menschlich type. And to divide the world between politics and religion, between the news of the day and the story of the Bible, to divide in that way was an anathema, was the sin. It was a blasphemy. For Harold Schulweis to walk the world with a fully cultivated, fully alive, fully responsive conscience is what Judaism demands of us every single day. We remember him with love. We remember him with reverence, and we carry his Torah very close to us. So take a moment, if you would, and join with me. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah. V'yalmad yivrach cherutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon of yom echon uchay d'chol beit Yisrael b'agalav v'zman kariv v'imramein. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'me'almayit barach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitrumam v'yitnasei v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalav shmei dekutsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tu'ishbechata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'imramein. Yehi shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imramein. Os shalom v'imrama v'yaseh shalom aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. In a moment in our history when conscience seems to be so easily discarded in the name of all sorts of causes and ideologies and movements, this rabbi said to us, no, conscience is the way that God enters our world. It is the soul of our spirituality. It is the purpose of our religious culture. It is the test of our Torah, its truth and its power in the world. And it's needed now more than ever. I wish you a very, very good Shabbos. Services, of course, will follow. I'll be speaking a little bit more about Rabbi Schulweis, and see you very, very, very soon. Take care. Be warm this week. Take care of yourself. Hope to see you very soon.